Hey there, welcome back to Twin Ravens. I'm your host, Hugh, and today we're continuing our journey through Herman Melville's classic, Moby Dick. In our last episode, we met Ishmael and learned about his decision to set sail on a whaling ship. Today, we're diving into Chapter 2, The Carpetbag, and Chapter 3, The Spouter Inn, where Ishmael's adventure begins to take shape. As he arrives in New Bedford and encounters a fascinating cast of characters. If you prefer just the narration without the extra content, check the description for links to the audio-only versions. To fully appreciate Ishmael's experiences, let's first explore the historical and cultural significance of New Bedford during the era of Moby Dick. In the mid-1800s, New Bedford was the whaling capital of the world. A bustling port city that drew whalers from far and wide. The whaling industry was at its zenith, bringing vast wealth and creating a diverse, vibrant community. The salty sea air carried the scents of tar, tobacco, and exotic spices from distant lands, while the streets echoed with the languages and laughter of sailors from around the globe. For Ishmael and many others, the journey to New Bedford represented a passage into a world of promise, danger, and adventure. Much like the gold rush of the 1840s or the dot-com boom of the 1990s, New Bedford was a place where people could leave their old lives behind and chase their dreams on the high seas. As we follow Ishmael's footsteps, keep in mind the excitement and trepidation he must have felt, a sensation that still resonates with those embarking on life-changing journeys today. With this context in mind, let's join Ishmael as he sets foot in New Bedford and begins his whaling voyage preparations. Chapter 2, The Carpetbag. I stuffed a shirt or two into my old carpet bag, tucked it under my arm, and started for Cape Horn in the Pacific. Quitting the good city of Old Manhattan, I duly arrived in New Bedford. It was a Saturday night in December. Much was I disappointed upon learning that the little packet for Nantucket had already sailed, and that no way of reaching that place would offer till the following Monday. As most young candidates for the pains and penalties of whaling stop at this same New Bedford, thence to embark on their voyage, it may as well be related that I, for one, had no idea of so doing, for my mind was made up to sail in no other than a Nantucket craft, because there was a fine, boisterous something about everything connected with that famous old island, which amazingly pleased me. Besides, though New Bedford has of late been gradually monopolizing the business of whaling, and though in this matter poor old Nantucket is now much behind her, yet Nantucket was her great original, the Tyre of this Carthage, the place where the first dead American whale was stranded. Where else but from Nantucket did those aboriginal whalemen, the Red Men, first sally out in canoes to give chase to the Leviathan? And where but from Nantucket, too, did that first adventurous little sloop put forth, partly laden with imported cobblestones, so goes the story, to throw at the whales, in order to discover when they were nigh enough to risk a harpoon from the bowsprit, now having a night, a day, and still another night following before me in New Bedford ere I could embark for my destined port. It became a matter of concernment where I was to eat and sleep meanwhile. It was a very dubious-looking, nay, a very dark and dismal night. Bitingly cold and cheerless, I knew no one in the place. With anxious grapnels, I had sounded my pocket and only brought up a few pieces of silver. So, wherever you go, Ishmael, said I to myself, as I stood in the middle of a dreary street, shouldering my bag and comparing the gloom towards the north with the darkness towards the south. Wherever in your wisdom you may conclude to lodge for the night, my dear Ishmael, be sure to inquire the price and don't be too particular. With halting steps, I paced the streets and passed the sign of the Crossed Harpoons. But it looked too expensive and jolly there. Further on, from the bright red windows of the Swordfish Inn, there came such fervent rays that it seemed to have melted the packed snow and ice from before the house. For everywhere else the congealed frost lay 10 inches thick in a hard, asphaltic pavement. Rather weary for me when I struck my foot against the flinty projections, because from hard, remorseless service the soles of my boots were in a most miserable plight. Too expensive and jolly again, thought I, pausing one moment to watch the broad glare in the street and hear the sounds of the tinkling glasses within. But go on, Ishmael, said I at last. Don't you hear? Get away from before the door. Your patched boots are stopping the way. So on I went. I now by instinct followed the streets that took me waterward, for there doubtless were the cheapest, if not the cheeriest inns. Such dreary streets, blocks of blackness, not houses on either hand, and here and there a candle, like a candle moving about in a tomb. At this hour of the night, of the last day of the week, that quarter of the town proved all but deserted. But presently I came to a smoky light, proceeding from a low, wide building, the door of which stood invitingly open. It had a careless look, as if it were meant for the uses of the public, so entering, the first thing I did was to stumble over an ash box in the porch. "Huh," thought I, as the flying particles almost choked me. Are these ashes from that destroyed city Gomorrah? But the crossed harpoons and the swordfish? This then must needs be the sign of the trap. However, I picked myself up, and hearing a loud voice within, pushed on and opened a second interior door. It seemed the great black parliament sitting in Tophet. 100 black faces turned round in their rows to peer. And beyond, a black angel of doom was beating a book in a pulpit. It was a Negro church, and the preacher's text was about the blackness of darkness, and the weeping and wailing and teeth gnashing there. Ishmael, muttered I, backing out. Wretched entertainment at the sign of the trap. Moving on, I at last came to a dim sort of light, not far from the docks, and heard a forlorn creaking in the air. And looking up, saw a swinging sign over the door, with a white painting upon it, faintly representing a tall, straight jet of misty spray, and these words underneath: "The Spouter Inn, Peter Coffin." Cough and spouter, rather ominous in that particular connection, thought I. But it is a common name in Nantucket, they say, and I suppose this Peter here is an emigrant from there. As the light looked so dim, and the place for the time looked quiet enough, and the dilapidated little wooden house itself looked as if it might have been carted here from the ruins of some burnt district, and as the swinging sign had a poverty-stricken sort of creak to it, I thought that here was the very spot for cheap lodgings and the best of pea coffee. It was a queer sort of place, a gable-ended old house, one side palsied, as it were, and leaning over sadly. It stood on a sharp, bleak corner, where that tempestuous wind, Euroclydon, kept up a worse howling than ever it did about poor Paul's tossed craft. Euroclydon, nevertheless, is a mighty pleasant zephyr to anyone indoors, with his feet on the hob quietly toasting for bed. In judging of that tempestuous wind called Euroclydon, says an old writer, of whose works I possess the only copy extant, it maketh a marvelous difference, whether thou lookest out at it from a glass window, where the frost is all on the outside, or whether thou observest it from that sashless window, where the frost is on both sides, and of which the white, death, is the only glazier. True enough, thought I, as this passage occurred to my mind. Old black letter, thou reasonest well. Yes, these eyes are windows, and this body of mine is the house. What a pity they didn't stop up the chinks and the crannies, though, and thrust in a little lint here and there. But it's too late to make any improvements now. The universe is finished, the copestone is on, and the chips were carted off 1,000,000 years ago. Poor Lazarus there, chattering his teeth against the curbstone for his pillow, and shaking off his tatters with his shiverings. He might plug up both ears with rags and put a corncob into his mouth, and yet that would not keep out the tempestuous Euroclydon. "Euroclydon?" says old Dives in his red silken wrapper. He had a redder one afterwards. Pooh, pooh, what a fine frosty night, how Orion glitters. What northern lights. Let them talk of their oriental summer climes of everlasting conservatories. Give me the privilege of making my own summer with my own coals. But what thinks Lazarus? Can he warm his blue hands by holding them up to the grand northern lights? Would not Lazarus rather be in Sumatra than here? Would he not far rather lay him down, lengthwise along the line of the equator? Yea, ye gods, go down to the fiery pit itself, in order to keep out this frost? Now that Lazarus should lie stranded there on the curbstone before the door of Dives? This is more wonderful than that an iceberg should be moored to one of the Moluccas. Yet Dives himself, he too lives like a czar in an ice palace made of frozen sighs. And being a president of a temperance society, he only drinks the tepid tears of orphans. But no more of this blubbering now. We are going a-whaling, and there is plenty of that yet to come. Let us scrape the ice from our frosted feet and see what sort of a place this spouter may be. Chapter 3. The Spouter Inn. Entering that gable-ended Spouter Inn, you found yourself in a wide, low, straggling entry with old-fashioned wainscots, reminding one of the bulwarks of some condemned old craft. On one side hung a very large oil painting so thoroughly besmoked, in every way defaced, that in the unequal cross-lights by which you viewed it, it was only by diligent study and a series of systematic visits to it, and careful inquiry of the neighbors, that you could anyway arrive at an understanding of its purpose. Such unaccountable masses of shades and shadows that at first you almost thought some ambitious young artist, in the time of the New England hags, had endeavored to delineate chaos bewitched. But by dint of much and earnest contemplation, and oft-repeated ponderings, and especially by throwing open the little window towards the back of the entry, you at last come to the conclusion that such an idea, however wild, might not be altogether unwarranted. But what most puzzled and confounded you was a long, limber, portentous black mass of something hovering in the center of the picture over three blue, dim, perpendicular lines floating in a nameless yeast. A boggy, soggy, squitchy picture truly, enough to drive a nervous man distracted. Yet was there a sort of indefinite, half-attained, unimaginable sublimity about it that fairly froze you to it, till you involuntarily took an oath with yourself to find out what that marvelous painting meant. Ever and anon, a bright but alas, deceptive idea would dart you through. It's the Black Sea in a midnight gale. It's the unnatural combat of the four primal elements. It's a blasted heath. It's a Hyperborean winter scene. It's the breaking up of the icebound stream of time. But at last, all these fancies yielded to that one portentous something in the picture's midst. That once found out, and all the rest were plain. But stop, does it not bear a faint resemblance to a gigantic fish? Even the great Leviathan himself? In fact, the artist's design seemed this, a final theory of my own, partly based upon the aggregated opinions of many aged persons with whom I conversed upon the subject. The picture represents a Cape Horner in a great hurricane, the half-foundered ship weltering there, with its three dismantled masts, alone visible, and an exasperated whale, purposing to spring clean over the craft, is in the enormous act of impaling himself upon the three mastheads. The opposite wall of this entry was hung all over with a heathenish array of monstrous clubs and spears. Some were thickly set with glittering teeth resembling ivory saws. Others were tufted with knots of human hair, and one was sickle-shaped, with a vast handle sweeping round like the segment made in the new mown grass by a long-armed mower. You shuddered as you gazed and wondered what monstrous cannibal and savage could ever have gone a death harvesting with such a hacking, horrifying implement. Mixed with these were rusty old whaling lances and harpoons all broken and deformed. Some were storied weapons, with this once long lance, now wildly elbowed, 50 years ago. Did Nathan Swain kill 15 whales between a sunrise and a sunset? And that harpoon, so like a corkscrew now, was flung in Javan seas and run away with by a whale, years afterwards slain off the Cape of Blanco. The original iron entered nigh the tail, and, like a restless needle sojourning in the body of a man, traveled full 40 feet, and at last was found embedded in the hump. Crossing this dusky entry, and on through yon low arched way, cut through what in old times must have been a great central chimney with fireplaces all round. You enter the public room. A still duskier place is this, with such low, ponderous beams above, and such old wrinkled planks beneath, that you would almost fancy you trod some old craft's cockpits, especially of such a howling night, when this corner-anchored old ark rocked so furiously. On one side stood a long, low, shelf-like table covered with cracked glass cases, filled with dusty rarities gathered from this wide world's remotest nooks. Projecting from the further angle of the room stands a dark-looking den, the bar, a rude attempt at a right whale's head. Be that how it may, there stands the vast arched bone of the whale's jaw, so wide a coach might almost drive beneath it. Within are shabby shelves, ranged round with old decanters, bottles, flasks, and in those jaws of swift destruction, like another cursed Jonah, by which name indeed they called him, bustles a little withered old man who, for their money, dearly sells the sailors deliriums and death. Abominable are the tumblers into which he pours his poison, though true cylinders within, the villainous green goggling glasses deceitfully tapered downwards to a cheating bottom. Parallel meridians, rudely pecked into the glass, surround these footpads goblets, that they made a straight wake for the whale's mouth. The bar, when the wrinkled little old Jonah, there officiating, soon poured them out brimmers all round. One complained of a bad cold in his head, upon which Jonah mixed him a pitch-like potion of gin and molasses, which he swore was a sovereign cure for all colds and catarrhs whatsoever, never mind of how long standing, or whether caught off the coast of Labrador, or on the weather side of an ice island. The liquor soon mounted into their heads, as it generally does even with the errantest topers newly landed from sea, and they began capering about most obstreperously. I observed, however, that one of them held somewhat aloof, and though he seemed desirous not to spoil the hilarity of his shipmates by his own sober face, yet upon the whole he refrained from making as much noise as the rest. This man interested me at once, and since the sea gods had ordained that he should soon become my shipmate, though but a sleeping partner one, so far as this narrative is concerned, I will here venture upon a little description of him. He stood full 6 feet in height, with noble shoulders and a chest like a cofferdam. I have seldom seen such brawn in a man. His face was deeply brown and burnt, making his white teeth dazzling by the contrast, while in the deep shadows of his eyes floated some reminiscences that did not seem to give him much joy. Then your objections indefinitely multiply. Nor was there any earthly reason why I as a sailor should sleep 2 in a bed. More than anybody else, for sailors no more sleep 2 in a bed at sea than bachelor kings do ashore. To be sure, they all sleep together in one apartment, but you have your own hammock and cover yourself with your own blanket and sleep in your own skin. The more I pondered over this harpooner, the more I abominated the thought of sleeping with him. It was fair to presume that being a harpooner, his linen or woolen, as the case might be, would not be of the tidiest, certainly none of the finest. I began to twitch all over. Besides, it was getting late, and my decent harpooner ought to be home and going bedwards. Suppose now he should tumble in upon me at midnight. How could I tell from what vile hole he had been coming? Landlord, I've changed my mind about that harpooner. I shan't sleep with him. I'll try the bench here. Just as you please. I'm sorry I can't spare ye a tablecloth for a mattress, and it's a plaguey rough board here. Feeling of the knots and notches. But wait a bit, Scrimshander. I've got a carpenter's plane there in the bar. Wait, I say, and I'll make ye snug enough. So saying, he procured the plane, and with his old silk handkerchief first dusting the bench, vigorously set to planing away at my bed, the while grinning like an ape. The shavings flew right and left, till at last the plain iron came bump against an indestructible knot. The landlord was near spraining his wrist, and I told him for heaven's sake to quit. The bed was soft enough to suit me, and I did not know how all the planing in the world could make eider down of a pine plank. So gathering up the shavings with another grin, and throwing them into the great stove in the middle of the room, he went about his business and left me in a brown study. I now took the measure of the bench and found that it was a foot too short, but that could be mended with a chair. But it was a foot too narrow, and the other bench in the room was about 4 inches higher than the planed one, so there was no yoking them. I then placed the first bench lengthwise along the only clear space against the wall, leaving a little interval between for my back to settle down in. But I soon found that there came such a draught of cold air over me from under the sill of the window that this plan would never do at all, especially as another current from the rickety door met the one from the window, and both together formed a series of small whirlwinds in the immediate vicinity of the spot where I had thought to spend the night. The devil fetch that harpooneer, thought I, but stop, couldn't I steal a march on him, bolt his door inside, and jump into his bed, not to be wakened by the most violent knockings? It seemed no bad idea, but upon second thoughts I dismissed it. For who could tell but what the next morning, so soon as I popped out of the room, the harpooneer might be standing in the entry, all ready to knock me down. Still, looking round me again, and seeing no possible chance of spending a sufferable night, unless in some other person's bed, I began to think that after all, I might be cherishing unwarrantable prejudices against this unknown harpooneer. Thinks I, I'll wait a while, he must be dropping in before long. I'll have a good look at him then, and perhaps we may become jolly good bedfellows after all. There's no telling. But though the other boarders kept coming in by ones, twos, and threes and going to bed, yet no sign of my harpooneer. Landlord, said I, what sort of a chap is he? Does he always keep such late hours? It was now hard upon 12 o'clock. The landlord chuckled again with his lean chuckle, and seemed to be mightily tickled at something beyond my comprehension. Can't sell his head? What sort of a bamboozlingly story is this you're telling me? Getting into a towering rage. Do you pretend to say, landlord, that this harpooneer is actually engaged this blessed Saturday night, or rather Sunday morning, in peddling his head around this town? That's precisely it, said the landlord, and I told him he couldn't sell it here. The market's overstocked. With what? Shouted I. With heads, to be sure. Ain't there too many heads in the world? I tell you what it is, landlord, said I quite calmly. You'd better stop spinning that yarn to me. I'm not green. Maybe not, taking out a stick and whittling a toothpick, but I rather guess you'll be done brown if that harpooneer hears you a slandering his head. I'll break it for him, said I, now flying into a passion again at this unaccountable farrago of the landlord's. It's broke already, said he. Broke, said I. Broke, do you mean? Sartin. And that's the very reason he can't sell it, I guess. Landlord, said I, going up to him, as cool as Mount Hecla in a snowstorm. Landlord, stop whittling. You and I must understand one another. And that too, without delay. I come to your house and want a bed. You tell me you can only give me half a one. Now the other half belongs to a certain harpooneer. And about this harpooneer, whom I have not yet seen, you persist in telling me the most mystifying and exasperating stories, tending to beget in me an uncomfortable feeling towards the man whom you design for my bedfellow. A sort of connection, landlord, which is an intimate and confidential one, in the highest degree. I now demand of you to speak out and tell me who and what this harpooneer is, and whether I shall be in all respects safe to spend the night with him. And in the first place, you'll be so good as to unsay that story about selling his head, which, if true, I take to be good evidence that this harpooneer is stark mad, and I've no idea of sleeping with a madman. And you, sir, you I mean landlord, you, sir, by trying to induce me to do so knowingly, would thereby render yourself liable to a criminal prosecution. Whoa, said the landlord, fetching a long breath. That's a purty long sarmon for a chap that rips a little now and then. But be easy, be easy. This here harpooneer I have been telling you of has just arrived from the South Seas, where he bought up a lot of bombed New Zealand heads. Great curios, you know. And he sold all of them but one. And that one he's trying to sell tonight, 'cause tomorrow's Sunday, and it would not do to be selling human heads about the streets when folks was going to churches. He wanted to last Sunday, but I stopped him, just as he was going out of the door with 4 heads strung on a string, for all the air like a string of Indians. This account cleared up the otherwise unaccountable mystery, and showed that the landlord, after all, had no idea of fooling me. But at the same time, what could I think of a harpooner who stayed out of a Saturday night, clean into the Holy Sabbath, engaged in such a cannibal business as selling the heads of dead idolaters? Depend upon it, landlord, that harpooner is a dangerous man. He pays regular, was the rejoinder. But come, it's getting dreadful late. You had better be turning flukes. It's a nice bed. Sal and me slept in that air bed the night we were spliced. There's plenty of room for 2 to kick about in that bed. It's an almighty big bed, that. Why, afore we give it up, Sal used to put our Sam and little Johnny in the foot of it. But I got a dreaming and sprawling about one night, and somehow Sam got pitched on the floor and came near breaking his arm. Arter that, Sal said it wouldn't do. Come along here, I'll give ye a glim in a jiffy. And so saying, he lighted a candle and held it towards me, offering to lead the way. But I stood irresolute. When looking at a clock in the corner, he exclaimed, it's Sunday. You won't see that harpooner tonight. He's come to anchor somewhere. Come along then. Do come, won't you come? I considered the matter a moment, and then upstairs we went, and I was ushered into a small room, cold as a clam, and furnished, sure enough, with a prodigious bed, almost big enough indeed for any 4 harpooneers to sleep abreast. There, said the landlord, placing the candle on a crazy old sea chest that did double duty as a washstand and center table. There, make yourself comfortable now, and good night to you. I turned around from eyeing the bed, but he had disappeared. Folding back the counterpane, I stooped over the bed without looking towards the bed, placed his candle a good way off from me on the floor in one corner, and then began working away at the knotted cords of the large bag I before spoke of as being in the room. I was all eagerness to see his face, but he kept it averted for some time, while employed in unlacing the bag's mouth. This accomplished, however, he turned round, when, good heavens, what a sight! Such a face! It was of a dark purplish yellow color, here and there stuck over, with large blackish-looking squares. Yes, it's just as I thought. He's a terrible bedfellow. He's been in a fight, got dreadfully cut, and here he is, just from the surgeon. But at that moment he chanced to turn his face so towards the light that I plainly saw they could not be sticking plasters at all. Those black squares on his cheeks, they were stains of some sort or other. At first I knew not what to make of this, but soon an inkling of the truth occurred to me. I remembered a story of a white man, a whale man too, who, falling among the cannibals, had been tattooed by them. I concluded that this harpooner, in the course of his distant voyages, must have met with a similar adventure. And what is it, thought I, after all? It's only his outside. A man can be honest in any sort of skin. But then, what to make of his unearthly complexion, that part of it, I mean, lying round about and completely independent of the squares of tattooing? To be sure, it might be nothing but a good coat of tropical tanning, but I never heard of a hot sun's tanning a white man into a purplish yellow one. However, I had never been in the South Seas, and perhaps the sun there produced these extraordinary effects upon the skin. Now, while all these ideas were passing through me like lightning, this harpooner never noticed me at all. But after some difficulty, having opened his bag, he commenced fumbling in it, and presently pulled out a sort of tomahawk and a sealskin wallet with the hair on. Placing these on the old chest in the middle of the room, he then took the New Zealand head, a ghastly thing enough, and crammed it down into the bag. He now took off his hat, a new beaver hat, when I came nigh, singing out with fresh surprise. There was no hair on his head, none to speak of at least, nothing but a small scalp knot twisted up on his forehead. His bald purplish head now looked for all the world like a mildewed skull. Had not the stranger stood between me and the door, I would have bolted out of it quicker than ever I bolted a dinner. Even as it was, I thought something of slipping out of the window, but it was the second floor back. I am no coward, but what to make of this head-peddling purple rascal altogether passed my comprehension. Ignorance is the parent of fear, and being completely nonplussed and confounded about the stranger, I confess I was now as much afraid of him as if it was the devil himself who had thus broken into my room at the dead of night. In fact, I was so afraid of him that I was not game enough just then to address him and demand a satisfactory answer concerning what seemed inexplicable in him. Meanwhile, he continued the business of undressing, and at last showed his chest and arms. As I live, these covered parts of him were checkered with the same squares as his face. His back, too, was all over the same dark squares. He seemed to have been in a 30 years' war, and just escaped from it with a sticking plaster shirt. Still more, his very legs were marked, as if a parcel of dark green frogs were running up the trunks of young palms. It was now quite plain that he must be some abominable savage or other shipped aboard of a whaleman in the South Seas, and so landed in this Christian country. I quaked to think of it. A peddler of heads, too, perhaps the heads of his own brothers. He might take a fancy to mine. Heavens, look at that tomahawk. But there was no time for shuddering, for now the savage went about something that completely fascinated my attention and convinced me that he must indeed be a heathen, going to his heavy grego, or rapal, or dreadnought, which he had previously hung on a chair. He fumbled in the pockets and produced at length a curious little deformed image with a hunch on its back, in exactly the color of a 3 days old Congo baby. Remembering the embalmed head, at first I almost thought that this black mannequin was a real baby, preserved in some similar manner. But seeing that it was not at all limber, and that it glistened a good deal like polished ebony, I concluded that it must be nothing but a wooden idol, which indeed it proved to be. For now the savage goes up to the empty fireplace, and removing the papered fireboard, sets up this little hunchbacked image, like a 10-pin, between the andirons. The chimney jambs, and all the bricks inside were very sooty, so that I thought this fireplace made a very appropriate little shrine or chapel for his Congo idol. I now screwed my eyes hard towards the half-hidden image, feeling but ill at ease meantime, to see what was next to follow. First, he takes about a double handful of shavings out of his grego pocket and places them carefully before the idol, then laying a bit of ship biscuit on top and applying the flame from the lamp, he kindled the shavings into a sacrificial blaze. Presently, after many hasty snatches into the fire, and still hastier withdrawals of his fingers, whereby he seemed to be scorching them badly, he at last succeeded in drawing out the biscuit, then blowing off the heat and ashes a little, he made a polite offer of it to the little Negro. But the little devil did not seem to fancy such dry sort of fare at all. He never moved his lips. All these strange antics were accompanied by still stranger guttural noises from the devotee, who seemed to be praying in a sing-song, or else singing some pagan psalmody or other, during which his face twitched about in the most unnatural manner. At last, extinguishing the fire, he took the idol up very unceremoniously and bagged it again in his grego pocket as carelessly as if he were a sportsman bagging a dead woodcock. All these queer proceedings increased my uncomfortableness, and seeing him now exhibiting strong symptoms of concluding his business operations and jumping into bed with me, I thought it was high time, now or never, before the light was put out, to break the spell in which I had so long been bound. But the interval I spent in deliberating what to say was a fatal one. Taking up his tomahawk from the table, he examined the head of it for an instant, and then holding it to the light, with his mouth at the handle, he puffed out great clouds of tobacco smoke. The next moment the light was extinguished, and this wild cannibal, tomahawk between his teeth, sprang into bed with me. I sang out, I could not help it now, and giving a sudden grunt of astonishment, he began feeling me. Stammering out something, I knew not what, I rolled away from him against the wall, and then conjured him, whoever or whatever he might be, to keep quiet, and let me get up and light the lamp again. But his guttural responses satisfied me at once that he but ill comprehended my meaning. "Hui deeble you," he at last said. "You no speaky, damn me, I killy." And so saying, The lighted tomahawk began flourishing about me in the dark. "Landlord, for God's sake, Peter Coffin," shouted I. "Landlord, watch, Coffin, angels, save me." "Speaky, telly me who he be, or damn me, I killa," again growled the cannibal, while his horrid flourishings of the tomahawk scattered the hot tobacco ashes about me till I thought my linen would get on fire. But thank heaven at that moment the landlord came into the room light in hand, and leaping from the bed I ran up to him. "Don't be afraid now," said he, grinning again. "Queequeg here wouldn't harm a hair of your head." "Stop your grinning," shouted I. "And why didn't you tell me that infernal harpooneer was a cannibal? I thought ye knowed it. Didn't I tell ye he was a peddling heads around town? But turn flukes again and go to sleep. Queequeg, look here, you sabby me, I sabby. You this man sleep you sabby." "Me sabby plenty," grunted Queequeg, puffing away at his pipe and sitting up in bed. "You giddy in," he added, motioning to me with his tomahawk and throwing the clothes to one side. He really did this in not only a civil but a really kind and charitable way. I stood looking at him a moment. For all his tattooings, he was on the whole a clean, comely-looking cannibal. "What's all this fuss I have been making about?" thought I to myself. "The man's a human being just as I am. He has just as much reason to fear me as I have to be afraid of him. Better sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian." "Landlord," said I, "tell him to stash his tomahawk there, or pipe, or whatever you call it. Tell him to stop smoking, in short, and I will turn in with him. But I don't fancy having a man smoking in bed with me. It's dangerous. Besides, I ain't insured." This being told to Queequeg, he at once complied and again politely motioned me to get into bed, rolling over to one side as much as to say, "I won't touch a leg of ye." "Good night, landlord," said I. "You may go." I turned in and never slept better in my life. Now that we've experienced chapters 2 and 3, let's unpack some key points and themes. In the carpet bag, Ishmael's arrival in New Bedford throws him into a new, bustling world, where he must navigate the challenges of finding lodging and getting his bearings. Melville's vivid descriptions of the town and its inhabitants set the stage for the colorful cast of characters and the adventures that await. The Spouter Inn introduces us to Queequeg, the enigmatic harpooneer covered in tattoos. Ishmael's initial apprehension and the inn's peculiar decor underscore the eclectic nature of the whaling world. This chapter also foreshadows the central themes of the novel, such as the duality of man and the search for meaning in a chaotic universe. Melville's rich prose immerses us in the sights, sounds, and sensations of Ishmael's experiences, laying the groundwork for the profound relationships and existential questions that will unfold as the story progresses. These themes and characters have much to teach us about our own lives and the world we navigate today. Let's explore those connections further. Ishmael's arrival in New Bedford and his night at the Spouter Inn echo the timeless human quest for belonging and understanding in an unfamiliar environment. His encounter with Queequeg, a man who initially seems so foreign and intimidating, challenges Ishmael's preconceptions and teaches him the value of looking beyond surface differences. This mirrors the way we navigate an increasingly diverse and interconnected world, where open-mindedness and empathy are essential for building meaningful connections. Insert an image or video clip that represents overcoming prejudices and forming connections. Moreover, Melville's nuanced portrayal of Queequeg defies stereotypes and promotes cultural understanding, a message that remains vitally relevant today. Ishmael's adaptability and willingness to embrace new experiences are qualities we can all learn from as we face the uncertainties and opportunities of modern life. Before we wrap up, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What aspects of Ishmael's experiences resonate with you most? Share your reflections in the comments. So what do you think about Ishmael's first impressions of New Bedford and his meeting with Queequeg? Can you relate to his mixture of excitement and apprehension as he embarks on this life-changing journey. Take a moment to reflect on a time when you stepped out of your comfort zone and ventured into the unknown. How did that experience shape you? And what lessons did you learn? Share your stories and insights in the comments below. Your perspectives can enrich our collective understanding of this timeless tale. As we conclude today's episode, let's look ahead to the adventures that await Ishmael and his newfound companion. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into chapters 2 and 3 of Moby Dick. We hope you enjoyed exploring the rich historical context, themes, and characters introduced in these early pages. In our next installment, we'll follow Ishmael and Queequeg as they set sail on the Pequod, where the true heart of the story begins to unfold. Remember, you can find audio-only versions of these episodes in the description. If you're enjoying our literary journey, please like, comment, and subscribe to Twin Ravens. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue bringing great stories to life. Until next time, keep chasing your own white whales.